So it's Romans chapter 7, and we're at the very beginning of the chapter. This is a fun start to the chapter because this one gets taken out of context. So we're going to establish the right context and work with it from there. So starting with verse 1, it says, "Or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over man as long as he lives. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So then, if, while her husband lives, she marries another man, she'll be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that you should bear fruit to God." And the problem is the context, which is actually stated, tends to get ignored. What was the focus of what we just read? I'm sorry, what?
Law.
The law. What do people tend to go to this passage over? Adultery. But what was the purpose stated for this passage? To show us things about the law and how it works. If we look at Galatians chapter 2, verse 19, this is saying the same sort of thing, but with a mild difference in emphasis. That was Galatians 2:19. And what follows is what we're very familiar with, though. Verse 19, "For I, through the law, died to the law, that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God. For if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain." Part of this is what we've been hammering on a bit as far as the Jews go. What good does the law accomplish in us? Well, we've gone through the different acts. Sacrifice. You take sacrifice out all on its own, and what does it do? Nothing. Giving away money. Mafia used to do that in the 70s. What did it accomplish them spiritually? Nothing. The works themselves accomplished nothing. Now, the way it says it here, different from in Romans, is back in 19, through the law, died to the law. Any thoughts on what he's referring to? This is Paul that's writing to Galatians. How did he, through the law, die to it?
Sacrifice.
I'm sorry, what?
Sacrifice.
Whose sacrifice?
The sacrifice.
Oh, the sacrifice. Okay. You're thinking towards the right direction. Through the law, died to the law. The way you kill the law in the Old Testament is to act against its authority. What was the authority under the Old Testament? The law. It ruled supreme. It was as the lawyers, Pharisees and Sadducees, love to do, treat it like a law book. These are the rules. If God says do this, we must do that, because then God has got to. They use it as a double binding kind of thing. We're bound, and when we obey, God's got to. But if you usurp, supplant, whatever you want to put that, something above the law, you essentially killed its authority over you because you're now claiming a totally different authority. Now, we get that when they claim the authority being idols and so forth, they put themselves under sin purely. And we understand how wrong that was, but what guidance does the law give to the idolater? Nothing. For the one who's given themselves over to an idol, doesn't matter what part of the law you kept. Because are you under the law? No. You're following an idol. The law is not going to help you. Because where is your authority? It's under that idol. So when you throw off the law, kill its ability to have a right impact on you. It doesn't matter what part you reach out and say, oh, but I like this part. If you are putting yourself in an idolatrous relationship with another God, it doesn't matter what piece you reach back and try to grab, you killed yourself relative to the law. What he's saying is, I'm declaring and accepting the authority of another greater than the law. Just like the idolater, I am killing the law's power over me by putting myself under the power and authority of Christ. That's what he means when he talks about through the law killing himself off to the law. Because what impact should the law now have when I am under Christ? Just like the idolater, the things that were supposed to help you don't necessarily have any value whatsoever under Christ. So keeping sacrifices for peace with God, that's not a thing as far as Christianity goes. Now, do we seek peace, right relationship with God? Yes. But, again, what did the animal sacrifice and a peace offering do? It taught us that there was a cost to be in that right relationship with God. Who shows us that the biggest? Christ does. His sacrifice was the cost for us to be able to be in the right relationship with God. One, he pays the price of sin, but two, he enables the right relationship part that God empowers in John 1:12. God enables the choice through the sacrifice of his Son, that if we, John 3:16, believe, and the word belief is faith, and there's two kinds of faith. There is one that is active and alive, and there's one that's dead. If it's active, it's doing. If it's dead, it's worthless. So, what he's saying here in Romans and in Galatians, when we put ourselves to death relative to the authority of the law, just like when a husband dies, is the wife still bound? No. the law has no control, responsibility, authority when the person, and notice the person that it's really talking about is he. When he's dead, then it's no longer a bound situation. We're now dead to the law. So the first part he's talking to sounds like just the Jews. Except, what were all the non-Jews bound to? Bound to sin, or bound to the gods they were committing idolatry with. They were putting themselves under those false gods in the same way they put themselves under sin. It was a choice. Just like being under the law, truth, was a choice. And being under Christ is a choice. But the thing both sides needed to realize, whether that be Jew or Gentile, you're now dead to that other system. So for the Jew, the easy thing to say is, okay, all that animal sacrifice, that's not where you need to be focusing any longer. You need to focus on the right relationship. For the Gentile, same kind of thing. How you worshiped before isn't what you're bound by and worshiping now. So the sacrifices, sometimes even human sacrifices, that doesn't cut it. The superstitions, because Paul's the one that comes right out and tells them, you worship many demons. Because that's the word he really uses. When he says, y'all are an interesting spiritual people, you worship many gods. No, the word's many demons. Because truth is, in the Eastern society at that time, they had stronger beliefs in jinns and demons than they did in gods, because the jinns were right down here on the earth. And therefore, we're going to mess with you that much quicker. You had to appease them first. Excuse me. So the superstitions, just like the practices, needed to be set aside. And instead, seek to focus on the new. When we were driving here this morning, it was funny. We went over a railroad track. And as soon as we go over the railroad track, Vicki lifts up her feet. And I sort of had to laugh, because when I rode on the Joy bus many, many years ago, whenever the bus would go over the railroad tracks, we always lifted our feet. And I turned to Vicki, why do we do that? She goes, I have no idea. It's just something always did. If you asked many of the Jews at the time of this writing, why did you do that? You'd get the exact same response. Because that's what we're told to do. That's not the reason why you were given it. And that's why they had the problem with the law. Obedience without the change of understanding, without the transformation that we talk about in the New Testament, is what got us to the Joshua generation. In Joshua's generation, the people he led into the promised land were all faithful, practicing Jews. Meaning, if it was in the law, they practiced that. They didn't seek God, they did the things of the law. Because what they did when they weren't doing the things of the law were also practicing idolatry. Because they wanted the goodies, and they knew they needed to do the right if they were going to get the land. They were blowing it. Because the practice was without understanding. In that respect, the Gentiles had a stronger understanding. Fear of their gods, fear of the demon and the jinn, fear. And they knew what the motivation for their practice really was. Fact is, that's what Paul has to address a couple different times in a couple different ways. And lets them know, okay, we're going to work with your scruples, your lifting the feet, but the reality is, when you eat meat, no other God gets control of you just because 95% of all meat was used in idol worship at that time. Out front, idol worship. Out back, butcher. In Florida, out front, voodoo. Out back, 50 to 60% of all the chicken shipped out of Florida. That was back in the 1980s. That was a scary kind of thing to watch. But essentially it was like 60 Minutes or somebody went through and said, oh, you're talking chicken out of Florida. Well, due to the following, it gets used in sacrifice, this, that, and the other before it gets then slipped back into the main poultry consumption line, cleaned up a little bit and sent on. Did the voodoo practice that somebody might have done to the chicken that I ended up cooking and making into Mexican have any impact really on me? No. We get that because we accept, one, that this is all dead. There is nothing over here, whether that be Judaism or idolatry. But that also then carries the weight of the law obedience of what we have put ourselves under Christ. Just like the law had that weight before Christ. And that's sort of the thing Paul's trying to not break here. So in Romans, when he's giving them that example, he's letting them know, first off, that old law, whatever that law system was, is not your current guide. However, we are talking about law, and you are accepting, choosing a different law system when you killed yourself off relative to that other system. The authority that you are under is still that level of authority. And just to clear up before I open it up for the questions, the law, when I'm using that word over and over again, I understand. Under Christ, we don't have a law system like the Old Testament. We do have something, though, that has authority and dominion over how we should be choosing to act. So in that respect, yes, there is a system. That system's based on God's love, based on relationship, based on our intention. And you could have used those exact same words with the Jewish law system and idolatry. So thoughts? Other than Rich talks too much and too fast, and I'm trying to slow down.
Well, the law was originally designed to create some discipline among
Yes.
the population. So there was a reason, it was a guide. Now, it was God's, so it wasn't suggested.
Mm-hmm.
It was a problem. Today, laws mean different things to different people.
Mm-hmm. Following along with the thought about it was to be a guide. Two of the ones that I always like to bring up, just because it's the most extreme, had to be told under the Old Testament law. Don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. and don't cuss out the deaf. It's pathetic. It's stupid. They had to be told. They needed that level of correction and guidance. And when you think about the Gentiles, none of theirs was really about being good. It was about appeasement. So they had it worse because they're not coming from a system guided by goodness that is towards God, but for our benefit. Under Christ, we're in the same boat of it's guided by goodness towards God for our benefit. As we become the people we're called to be, excuse me, under Christ, it's still towards God. Now, in the towards God aspect of it, we've got it a lot more blatantly than they had it back in the Old Testament. You still have the Psalms, you still have the Proverbs, you still have the story examples of how God shows his love towards his people. But in the New Testament, it doesn't mince words and just give you, here's the example, here's the example. He comes right out and says, boom, what do? You're a parent. Do you give them the scorpion or do you give them bread? Do you give them water? Do you give them a stone? You give them the right things. Why? You love, you care. Congratulations. Even the tax collectors get that. What's missing? God. That love, that care needs to have a right motivator and a right source. When the source, the example we're following, is a godly one, and we're doing it for God, that's when we're, word we already used once, transforming ourselves. Unlike the Old Testament and really unlike the Gentile world. So, excuse me, bring it back to where we started from. The message is, all that, Jew or Gentile, that you held on to good and tight, let go like it's a dead body. Grab hold just as tight, if not tighter, than you ever held on to the other. Because it's not just the authority and power, it's the benefit. It's the part of John 3:16, for God so loved, what should we be responding to? Love. When that becomes the motivator, think about this one. Driving 70 miles per hour on the highway. It's real easy for a lot of people to slip on up and over. Vicky was going this morning. Rich, are you out there to get there in a hurry? And I'm like, no, I'm trying to get away from these other idiot drivers that are not doing so hot. But how bound am I in my obedience to that 70 miles per hour? Well, it sort of fluctuates. Some days I'm more bound than others. Some days I'm not trying to get hit by somebody else. There's no relationship in that. It's a law. And I work with it when it's working with me really well, and when it's not working, I'm not as good as I should be, because slowing down is asking for it, because of the way other people drive, especially the farther south you go. Get down to Miami and oh boy, not a pleasant place when you're only going 10 miles over the speed limit. There's no relationship. I could care less when I'm above the speed limit by that little bit. I'm caring more about myself. There's no relationship. There's no commitment. I have a full understanding of what the law says. Who made that law? People did. How right is that law? Yeah. Depends on how badly you want to get rear-ended by the guy that's coming up. Zoom, 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 boosh. Those.
About how right the law is. It's about they don't enforce the law, so nobody obeys the law.
Bingo. They don't enforce it. People don't obey it to the scary level.
If you don't have laws, what do you have? What would you, if you didn't have speed limits, what would you have on highways? If you didn't have noise ordinance in cities, what would you have? I mean, if you think about some of these laws and everything else, yeah, they're restricting people and everything, they're reducing their freedoms and everything. But it's like, if you don't have laws, you have a lot of chaos, you have a lot more dead people.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have to worry about someone rear-ending. You'd have people rear-ended all over the highways.
Right. But now let's take it to a different law. Marriage, which is the one he's talking about here. Obeying the letter of the law. If I don't cheat and I provide roof overhead, money for paying the bills, food, do I have a great relationship with my wife? By not disobeying the rules? And the obvious answer is no. Sort of stinky winky. Because there is no relational commitment. It's just strict obedience. I'm obeying better than I obey the speed limit. Shouldn't that be awesome? And the answer is no. And we get how wrong that is. And it doesn't even have to be husband and wife. It can be parent and child. Child can obey and do everything the parent asks of them and have no relationship with them. Is that a good or healthy situation? The answer is no. It's the reason why a lot of kids growing up in the church still can't talk to their own parents when they get to be teenagers. Because developing and maintaining the relationship was sort of off the radar. I'm teaching them to do good. They're not doing bad. It must be fine. No. Paul gives this example of marriage because it's not a pure law only thing. It's law and relationship. Unlike the Old Testament, because okay, how did they treat marriage in the Old Testament? It was all law for the men, and like I said, there's a he emphasis here, that the women were bound by, which is how he says it here. And that's nasty. That's not what we're looking for under Christ. We're not after a law that by strict obedience to it is supposed to be nasty. And that's part of the reason why, favorite topic, it tells us, fruit of the Spirit, increase in it. What kind of law is that? A law of relationship. Grow and develop in the relationship aspects. Because that's when this has its biggest impact. It's sort of like the TV program that I ever hardly watched, Cheers, where everybody knows your name. Norm, and I can't even tell you which character Norm was. But they always said it whenever this person walked in. Might have been the postman. I got a nod. It was the postman. They all knew Norm. Norm felt good about showing up there. Why? Because they all knew him. And it wasn't just a matter of saying his name. They knew what he did. They knew what his interests were. They knew what annoyed him. It was a relationship. It became a norm. I actually talked to a friend about this one time. I asked him, why do you go to that bar? If one thing costs you as much as a 6-pack, why are you paying that kind of price? Well, I know the bartender and I know the person who sits on the stool to the right of me is going to be there at 5:30 every night on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I know this person will be there and I know this person will be there. What kind of relationship do you have with them? Oh, I don't really know them that well, but I know they'll be there and they know me. So you're willing to pay $5 for a stinking beer and tip the person for the stinking beer just so you can be someplace where people know you and don't really care. Well, it's better than sitting at home alone. Relationship. Law towards God for our benefit. So he starts that out here, and then verse 5, for when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. Serve. What? The law. How? Not the letter, the Spirit, the intent. What is it supposed to be doing? Transforming and renewal of the mind. Why? Because we need to become Christ-like. And that's not talking about getting nailed down on a cross. It's talking about our attitude. It's talking about having the heart and eyes and ears that can see a Samaritan woman. When as a Jew, you don't talk to Samaritans to begin with, let alone be seen talking to a female Samaritan when you're male in the middle of the day. That's just not doing it.
In short, it's doing it because you want to, not because you have to.
Yes.
It's like a child that wants to do something for the parent to make them proud of them. They do it because they want to. If they're forced to do it, it's a whole different matter.
Yep. And that's the difference between a child that cleans their room because they understand, one, how it appeals to the parent, but two, understand how it benefits them. There's that towards the parent, rightness, but there's also the benefit to self. The one who learns to be organized and sort of neat, there's benefit to that. And I can tell you right now, I'm not the guy that's the organized and neat. And up until about 10 years ago, I could have 3 stacks of paper on my desk this thick. And if you asked me for information, I could tell you, middle stack, 2/3 of the way down, it's upside down. Go into it 2/3 of the way down, you would find the page I was talking about, and there were the instructions for some software license or whatever. I could do that then. I can't do that now. I didn't get myself organized the way I probably should have, which guess what? Makes organization for me right now that much harder. Parallel, fruit of the Spirit. If we don't work on it when we're younger, it doesn't get any easier as we get older. There's a kids video, and I love it because of the truth that I'd say almost everybody misses about it. It's called Bartok the Magnificent. It's about a little itty bitty bat. And this itty bitty bat is out to make sure everything goes right in the end. And he's sent off on this quest, and he's supposed to get all these ingredients that are supposed to produce a potion that will make you 10 times on the outside what you are on the inside. And in the end, the person who ends up stealing the potion from him is a nasty person. And they become this super, super nasty dragon that destroys a city. And you think, well, yeah, that's a kid's story. No, it's not. It's an adult story. And the secret potion is called age. And we're all drinking it. The older we become, the more we become what we've been striving to be. If it's not the Christ-transformed person, if we don't make the effort to grow the fruit of the Spirit, just because we get old doesn't mean we mellow out and become the loving grandpa Santa Claus kind of person. It means if we've been a nasty piece of work all of our lives and haven't striven, not sure if that's a word, because striving I know is not a word either. Striving. If we have not been striving to become a person who is grounded in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. If we haven't been working on those things all along, they don't just pop up at the end. What we've been striving to be all along by default, meaning not choosing to do different, means where were we sitting? In this camp. What's my authority? God says obey. I'm not moving. Because that would imply effort, and I'm just feeling a bit too tired. When we don't give the law the authority that we chose, the authority it should have, we might as well never have moved. So, what he's talking about here, we have been delivered from the law. Don't go back to what you're dead to. You made the choice. Why? Because it's right. Why? Because it benefits us. Remember it and act in it. Because otherwise, we're acting in death. It's not just saying sin is death. We have gone back to that which we killed off. And it doesn't work. We're up against time. Thank you all much.